Unit 2. History of Development of Constitutions in Nigeria. 2.1 Introduction. Nigeria was colonized by Britain. Because of this, it has a rich history of constitutional development, having witnessed many constitutions and constitutional changes from the time of colonial rule till date. Constitutional development in Nigeria is usually divided into two periods as follows. A. B. Colonial era, 1861. 1959. Post-colonial era, 1960s. 1999. The colonial era. British colonial rule started in Nigeria in 1861 as a result of annexation of Lagos and called Colony of Lagos. After the annexation of Lagos, more territories were acquired in southern Nigeria and called Southern Protectorate. Both the Colony of Lagos and Southern Protectorate were merged together in 1902 and called the Colony and Protectorate of Southern Nigeria. Later, the Northern Territories were also conquered and called the Northern Protectorate. In 1914, both the Colony and Southern Protectorate and Northern Protectorate were merged together and called the Colony and Protectorate of Nigeria under Lord Frederick Lugard as the first Governor-General. The 1914 amalgamation was the beginning of Nigeria. The Crown Colony system of direct rule was adopted. By this system, all annexed colonies were seen as British territories. The governor of any colony was appointed by the Crown in London and was responsible to the Crown through the Secretary of State for Colonies. I. Lugard Administration. Lord Lugard was the first Governor-General of a new Nigeria. Note that there was no official constitution under Lord Lugard. He governed Nigeria with two bodies, namely, the Executive Council and the Nigerian Legislative Council. The Executive Council was composed of only British official members who were only expected to advise the governor on administration, whereas the Legislative Council composed of official members and appointed African unofficial members. The Legislative Council had no legislative power but purely advisory responsibilities. The Governor-General exercised both executive and legislative powers and responsibilities, such as as head of government, presided over meetings of the executive and legislative councils. DG. Power to appoint, promote, discipline officials of the colony. The third. Formulate economic and social policies. IV. Allocate lands. E. Clifford Constitution 1922. Sir Hugh Clifford took over from Lord Lugard in 1919. He sought to address the shortcomings and complaints of the Lord Lugard era. He introduced the first official constitution of Nigeria in 1922. The major highlights of the constitution included enlargement of the Nigerian Council, Legislative Council to 46 members, official 23, unofficial 19, out of which 10 members were Nigerians, and elected 4, based on limited franchise of minimum of 100 annual income. Elections were introduced into Nigerian politics as the 10 Nigerian members of the Legislative Council were elected. Formation emergence of the first political party in Nigeria, for example, Nigerian National Democratic Party, NNDP, by Herbert Macaulay. Tenure of 5 years was given to both elected and unelected unofficial members of the legislative. Newspapers were allowed to be established by interested individuals. The Third Richard's Constitution 1946. After Clifford, there were two other governors, Sir Cameron and Sir Bernard Boudillon, before Sir Arthur Richards. During their times, Cameron and Bourdillon relied heavily on the Clifford Constitution and achieved little or nothing in terms of constitutional development. The only notable achievement of Bourdillon was to dividing Nigeria into East, West, and North for administrative purposes. This became the platform for regionalism in Nigeria. When Sir Arthur Richards took over from Sir Bernard Bourdillon, there were pressures already from the educated elites. The complaint was that the Clifford Constitution did not allow for more participation and representation of the indigenous population of Nigerians in their affairs. As a result, Richards presented a new proposal of constitutional amendments. The main features of the Richards Constitution included Nigeria was officially divided into three regions, Northern, Eastern, and Western regions. A central legislative council was established, made up of 44 members, official 16, and unofficial. 28. Regional houses of assembly were established with limited legislative powers. They were elected from native authorities. The East and West regions had unicameral legislature, while Northern region was granted bicameral legislature, House of Assembly and House of Chiefs. Limited franchise was reduced to 50 people to vote and be voted for. The McPherson Constitution, 1951. Sir John McPherson succeeded Arthur Richard in March 1949. Despite the reforms introduced, the Richard Constitution was criticized by the elites for exclusion from the election process because nominations into both regional assemblies and the Legislative Council came from native authorities. After consultations, a constitutional conference was held at Ibadan in January 1950s. The decisions of the conference became the McPherson Constitution of 1951. The major feature of the McPherson Constitution includes provided for a federal legislature called House of Representatives, with 136 members, ex officio 6I, nominated by Governor, 6I, Northern Region, 68, Western Region 34, and Eastern Region 34. Regional assemblies were retained. Northern and Western regions were granted bicameral legislature, while Eastern Regional unicameral legislature. Established Council of Ministers headed by the Governor. Office of Premier was created for each region. Regional executive councils were created headed by premiers. Regional assemblies were given legislative powers over agriculture, local government, education, health, industries, public welfare, etc. v. Littleton Constitution, 1954. Sir Oliver Littleton took over from McPherson on May 20, 1953. He observed that despite the key changes introduced by the McPherson Constitution, the regions were not united. A motion by Chief Anthony Ahoro for Nigeria to get independence in 1956, and the crisis that followed forced Littleton to hold quick constitutional conferences in London, 1953, and Lagos, 1954. The decisions of these conferences led to the Littleton Constitution of 1954. The highlights of the Littleton Constitution included: Nigeria was made a federation and officially adopted the federal system of government with 3 regions, North, East, West. Southern Cameroon opted out of Nigeria through referendum. Regions were given their executive and legislative powers. Consequently, Western and Eastern regions became self-governing in 1957, while Northern region became self-governing in 1959. The regions had their own civil service and judiciary. Lagos was removed from Western region and made federal capital territory. West African Court of Appeal was abolished and Supreme Court of Nigeria was established to hear appeals from regional high courts. Governor and the Governor General were no longer members of regional and central legislature. 2.3 Post-colonial era. The major constitutional changes that have taken place from 1960s when Nigeria got independence till date. Independence in 1960s signaled the breakaway of Nigeria from British colonial rule. Independence Constitution, 1960. The Independence Constitution granted independence to Nigeria from Britain and come into effect on October 1, 1960. This constitution adopted the key and favorable elements of other constitutions before it. The notable highlights of the Independence Constitution include: the federal system of government was retained. Legislative powers were divided between federal and regions, exclusive, concurrent, and residual lists. Local governments were under regions. Parliamentary system of government was introduced. Dual executive was introduced, Prime Minister, head of government, and Governor General, ceremonial head of state. Regions were headed by premiers. Federal government had bicameral legislature, Senate and House of Representatives. Regions had bicameral legislature, House of Assembly and House of Chiefs. The Privy Council, in the British House of Lords, still served as the highest court of appeal instead of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. Supremacy of the Constitution was entrenched to allay the fears of minority groups. J. Republican Constitution, 1963. The Independence Constitution of 1960s granted independence to Nigeria, but in practice, the independence was not real. The constitution was still laced with provisions of allegiance to the authority of the Queen in London. To resolve the issues, a constitutional conference was held in Lagos on July 25, 1963. The conference resolved that Nigeria should be a republic with all powers domiciled in Nigeria. On September 19, 1963, the Republican Constitution was passed into law by the Federal House of Representatives and came into force on October 1, 1963. The main features of the Republican Constitution include: the Queen of England ceased to be head of state. The President became head of state with ceremonial duties, while the Prime Minister remained head of government. The Privy Council was replaced by the Supreme Court of Nigeria as the highest appeal court of the land. Parliamentary seats, Senate and House of Representatives, were increased for more representation after Midwest region was created. Judicial Service Commission was abolished, leaving appointment of judges to the Prime Minister. The 1963 Republican Constitution did not last long because of political crisis in the country. The Constitution was suspended by the military coup of January 15, 1966. There was a civil war between 1967, 1970s, and prolonged military rule in Nigeria until 1979. The third, 1979 Presidential Constitution. The military regime of Murtala Muhammad Olusegun Obasanjo ushered in the 1979 Constitution, which brought back civil rule in Nigeria. Chief FRA headed a constitution drafting committee, while Justice Udo Udoma headed the Constituent Assembly to debate, make necessary adjustments, and approve the draft constitution. The constitution came into effect on October 1, 1979. Alhaji Shehu Shagari was elected as president under this constitution. The major features of the constitution were: presidential system was introduced to replace parliamentary system of government. The president is to be elected directly by the electorates in a general election. The president is to serve as both head of state and head of government for a tenure of 4 years. Bicameral legislature was retained, Senate and House of Representatives. Executive governors were to be elected for each state. States had unicameral legislature. Local government councils were provided for. There was separation of powers. Legislature and executive were separated. Abuja was named Federal Capital Territory. 1989 Constitution. Muhammadu Buhari overthrew Alhaji Shehu Shagari in 1983 and became head of state. He too was toppled by Ibrahim Babangida in 1985. To return the country to civil rule, Babangida set up 3 different bodies: A. Political Bureau, 1987, B. Constitution Review Committee, 1986, and OEACA Constituent Assembly, 1988. The report was submitted to Armed Forces Ruling Council, AFRC, in April 1989. The Constitution was promulgated in October 1989. The main features of the Constitution were: presidential system of government was maintained as in 1979 Constitution. Two-party system was introduced into the Constitution. National Republican Convention, NRC, and Social Democratic Party, SDP, part-time legislature was introduced as legislators were to be paid sitting allowance only. The electorate could withdraw any legislator who no longer enjoyed their confidence. Minimum qualifications of age and education were given for election into political offices. Local governments were given greater autonomy, e.g., increase in number of local councils, direct election of chairmen and councillors, direct allocation of revenues. Recognition of 3 forms of Nigerian citizenship: by birth, registration, and naturalization. Provision for independence of the judiciary and fundamental rights of citizens. The 989 Constitution did not disengage the military from government completely, as expected. Local government, legislative, and gubernatorial were held successfully at different times. But the presidential election of 12 June 1993, which involved MKO Abiola, was inconclusive and annulled by President Babangida. This was the origin of June 12. The events that followed brought General Sani Abacha and General Abdul Salami Abubakar to power. 1999 Constitution. The 1999 Constitution came into effect on October 1, 1999. Brought back democratic rule to Nigeria and remains in force till date. Some amendments, alterations, modifications have been made since it come into force. It is now referred to and quoted as 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, as amended. The 1999 Constitution adopted most of the features of the 1979 Constitution. The main features are: the executive presidential system is adopted, bicameral federal legislature, National Assembly, Senate, AMP, HORS, members of National Assembly are directly elected by their constituencies. 36 states and 774 local government councils are recognized. The governors have executive powers, unicameral state legislature, state house of assembly. State governments using SIEC to conduct elections into local councils. Provisions for revenue allocation formula are made. Provides for multi-party system. Provides for fundamental rights of citizens, Chapter 4 of the Constitution, etc. Questions and answers. Question 1. When did Nigeria gain independence from British rule? Answer. Nigeria gained independence on October 1, 1960. Question 2. What was the Macpherson Constitution, and when was it introduced? Answer. The Macpherson Constitution was introduced in 1951. It established a federal structure, increased regional autonomy, and created a central government with 3 regions, Northern, Western, and Eastern. Question 3. Which constitution replaced the British monarch as the ceremonial head of state with a ceremonial president in Nigeria? Answer. The Republican Constitution of 1963 replaced the British monarch as the ceremonial head of state with a ceremonial president. Question 4. What marked the collapse of the First Republic in Nigeria? Answer. The First Republic in Nigeria was marked by political instability, ethnic tensions, and a series of coups, ultimately leading to its collapse in 1966. Question 5. When did Nigeria adopt the presidential system of government? Answer. The presidential system of government was adopted in Nigeria with the introduction of the 1979 Constitution during the Second Republic. Question 6. What is the current constitution of Nigeria, and when was it adopted? Answer. The current constitution of Nigeria is the 1999 Constitution, which was adopted in 1999, marking the country's return to civilian rule. Unit 3, Rule of Law.